Speaking of 9/11 and the 20-plus year war that it triggered,
Yeah.
and you being here today, speaking with the families, speaking with the sons and daughters of firefighters who have died, police officers that have died.
Yeah.
We both served. We have friends that served. I mean, what is it like for you to talk to these people in such an intimate setting, knowing that the Biden-Harris administration is actively funding terrorism?
Yeah.
And not just them, every tax-paying American. You're funding them, I'm funding them.
Right.
Everybody that's paying U.S. taxes is now funding terrorism.
Yeah.
We're sending $40 to $87 million a week to the Taliban. The IG report came out and said that they had accidentally sent $239 million to the Taliban. 9/11 was a $500,000 budget. What are they going to do with $239 million?
Yeah.
I've been working really hard to bring this to light
Crazy. Yeah.
with a colleague of mine, Scott Mann, and Sarah Adams, and we've made a lot of headway. We brought a petition up to bring Masood in to talk about how some of our policies are affecting Afghanistan and the fact that we're funding them.
Sure.
That bill's been kind of squashed. Bill Hagerty now is spinning something up in the Senate that's
right.
a little more aggressive.
Yep.
And I know we are pending a potential government shutdown on October 1st. Would it be a good idea to shut the U.S. government down if we continue to fund terrorism?
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy if you think about it, right? Because the Taliban, so Al-Qaeda, of course, was the organization that planned 9/11, but they had the explicit support of the Taliban, right? It's like, North Korea and China during the Korean War, right? These guys are working hand in hand. They're working in the same territory. And the idea that we're now sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Taliban after they've taken complete control of the country, and of course, they've got a lot of our military equipment there, it's completely insane. And, just on the mechanics of a government shutdown fight. So I've been in the Senate all of 2 years. I've never voted for continuing resolution, in part because of this very issue. And what I mean by continuing resolution, like, you can do two things in the budgetary process, right? You can basically take what you've done and rubber stamp it for another 3, 6 months, or a year. That's a continuing resolution. Then there's the traditional appropriations process where you actually go in and say, why the hell are we spending money on that? Should we be spending less money on this thing, more money on this thing? And you actually have the real budgetary process that leaders should do, right? I don't like the continuing resolutions because you do this exact thing, right? You're rubber stamping more money for organizations like the Taliban. By the way, while we're on that topic, rubber stamping more money for the open border, because you talk to people, right? And one of the biggest fears with the open border, there's a lot, but one of the biggest fears with the open border is, okay, how are all those people getting into our country? We know in 9/11, we just had garbage security. A lot of them flew in, were training in American flight schools. We now know that there are thousands of military-age men who have come through that southern border from places like Afghanistan, Iran, and so forth. And so, yeah, man, why shouldn't we be trying to force this government shutdown fight to get something out of it that's good for the American people? Like, why have a government if it's not a functioning government? And if you have a government that's spending hundreds of millions of dollars funding terrorism and then facilitating those people to come across the American southern border, it's totally insane.
I mean, it's asinine. I mean, people cannot afford school supplies for their kids.
It's crazy.
But we're sending $1 billion a year to a terrorist organization.
Yeah. After, by the way, they killed 13 of our Marines, or I guess, 11 Marines and a couple other service members just a year ago, actually, just 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago today. If that can't motivate our leadership to get off their asses and actually say, we're done funding the Taliban, then what would actually motivate it? And again, the way Washington works, man, is it's like a rubber stamp mentality. It's that we did this thing 20 years ago, and maybe it made sense when we were trying to convince the Afghans to become more self-sufficient, to train their own military so the Taliban wouldn't take over. Whatever. I'm not going to judge what we did 20 years ago, but even if it made sense 20 years ago, it sure as hell doesn't make sense today when the people who are in control of Afghanistan are the literal Taliban, the people who killed our Marines, and by the way, are actively training terrorists right now. But that's what you get when you rubber stamp everything from the past instead of running a functional government where you ask yourself what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in this year, not 20 years ago, then that's how this stuff ends up happening.
Speaking of wars, I think a lot of Americans are tired of funding all these wars.
Yeah,
And
of course.
last night on the debate stage, we saw Trump and Kamala kind of bat that back and forth.
One of his best moments, I thought, last night.
Trump had mentioned that he would have this war done before you and him actually take office.
Yeah.
How exactly would that be negotiated?
Yeah, so one thing I'll say about the president, Republicans, obviously I'm a Republican, I'm running as the Republican VP nominee. We like to give Trump credit, justifiably so, for being strong. I don't think that we give the president enough credit for smart diplomacy. It's not just strength, it's also intelligence, right? He did both of those things, and that's why we had a peaceful world. So what Trump was really good at is saying, yeah, okay, this guy's a screwball, this guy's a bad person, but sometimes you have to deal with screwballs and bad people, right? I mean, in World War II, we allied with Joseph Stalin to beat Adolf Hitler. We can engage in diplomacy even with very bad guys. And because of that, I think he was able to keep the world at peace for a very long time. I mean, look, you didn't have the, Iran and Iranian militias attacking Israel. You didn't have, of course, the war in Eastern Europe. You didn't have what's going on in Africa. You didn't have what's going on potentially in East Asia, where the Chinese, I think, are on the cusp of invading Taiwan. I hope not, but I think it's very possible it's going to happen in the next couple of years. So you need somebody that, first of all, people are terrified of, right? You need to be worried that if Donald Trump says something, or Kamala Harris, God forbid, says something, that they actually mean it, right? But you believe that with Donald Trump, you don't believe that with Kamala Harris, right? That's deterrence. That's, oh crap, if we screw with these guys, they're going to come after us hard. But then it's also like sitting down and understanding, like, Russia wants this war to end. Ukraine wants this war to end. Europe, which, by the way, has underfunded this war while American taxpayers have been very generous to the Ukrainians, the Europeans want this war to end because it's jacking up their energy prices. So I think what this looks like is Trump sits down, he says to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, you guys need to figure out, what does a peaceful settlement look like? And what it probably looks like is something like the current line of demarcation between Russia and Ukraine. That becomes like a demilitarized zone. It's heavily fortified so the Russians don't invade again. Ukraine remains its independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join, some of these sort of allied institutions. And I think that's ultimately what this looks like. And by the way, the Germans and other countries have to fund some Ukrainian reconstruction. That is what the deal, I think, is ultimately going to look something like. But I think what's going to happen is President Trump's going to go in there as the president-elect. They're scared of him in Russia. They're worried about him in Europe because they know that he actually means what he says. And I think he's going to be able to come to a deal very quickly, because this is what's insane about this, dude, is the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans are all saying, we can't fight this war forever. Well, why the hell are you fighting it for another day if all of them are trying to find a way to solve it? The answer is, or at least to get over it, right, to stop it. You're not going to solve the war, but you can at least bring the thing to a stop. The answer is Joe Biden is asleep at the wheel. Kamala Harris doesn't know what the hell she's doing. And so their policy is throw money at this problem, hope the Ukrainians are able to achieve a military victory that even the Ukrainians are saying we can't achieve. Donald Trump's policy is, yes, to be strong, but also to be smart. Negotiate.
When it comes to these wars, especially Ukraine,
Yeah.
I mean, it gets painted as some type of a humanitarian thing.
Sure.
I'm not buying the humanitarian thing. I mean, if
We
it was
shouldn't,
humanitarian,
yeah.
we'd be in Venezuela right now.
Neither do I, yeah.
We'd be in Brazil. We'd be all over.
Yeah.
What is
We'd
the
be in our own
real-
communities, kicking out 25 million illegal aliens. Yeah.
Good point. What are we there for?
Man, it's a tough question. And I think some people have convinced themselves that this is like the great humanitarian mission of our time. And I think that's what drives some of it, even though I think it's fake and it's wrong. I think some people have convinced themselves this is like a war of good versus evil, right? Or Russia evil, Ukraine good. And once you get yourself in that fairy tale mindset, you can justify a lot of stupid activity and a lot of stupid decisions because, of course, we always want to support the good guys. But maybe the truth is the Russians shouldn't have invaded, but the Ukrainians have got a lot of corruption problems too, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. And unfortunately, you have no American leader who's willing to actually understand what's really going on over there. I mean, I think that some people, look, are going to get rich from that war. You talk about, BlackRock and some of these major financial institutions talking about spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukrainian reconstruction. We know the stock prices of defense contractors have skyrocketed since the Ukraine war started. So it's like a complicated mixture, right? Some people are getting rich. Some people are convinced they're the good guys. Some people are convinced this is a great humanitarian mission. And it ends up leading to a very stupid place. And it's one of the reasons why I just want Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to say, what the hell are we doing? What is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? And the fact that you don't have a president or a vice president who can articulate that means we probably shouldn't be there to begin with.
Is there any validity to the point that Crimea sits on a very large natural gas deposit?
Oh, I'm sure there's a huge part of that, right? I mean, look, Ukraine is not just Crimea, but is a very resource-rich country, right? And it always has been, and it's got great agricultural resources, it's got great natural gas resources, and again, a lot of wars get fought over natural resources, and I guarantee you both the reasons the Russians are interested in part, the reasons the Europeans are interested in part, and certainly a lot of American investors, it's got a lot to do with money. Let's just be honest.